History rarely begins with certainty. It begins with questions. Questions whispered across deserts, carved into stone, carried through prayer, war, exile, and return. Few lands on Earth have inspired as many questions as the narrow strip of territory between the Mediterranean Sea and the Jordan River, a land smaller than many modern cities, yet vast in its influence on human civilization. Why has this land, scarcely visible on the world's map, become the focal point of millennia of devotion, conquest, prophecy, and bloodshed? Why have empires risen to claim it, religions sanctified it, and generations fought to control it? The story of Israel is not simply the story of a nation. It is the story of one of humanity's most contested landscapes, a crossroads where faith, power, identity, and destiny collide. To understand Israel is to travel backward through nearly 4,000 years of human memory. It requires stepping into a world long before modern borders and national flags existed. A world of wandering tribes, ancient kingdoms, divine covenants, and imperial ambitions. It begins not with a state but with a promise. In the ancient Near East, sometime in the early 2nd millennium BCE, a semi-nomadic man named Abram, later known as Abraham, emerges in historical tradition. According to the Hebrew scriptures, Abraham leaves the great Mesopotamian city of Ur after receiving a divine command. The voice he hears promises something extraordinary, that his descendants will become a great people and that the land of Canaan will belong to them. Canaan at that time was not empty. It was a vibrant region dotted with fortified city-states. Trade caravans crossed its valleys. Armies marched through its passes. The great civilizations of Egypt and Mesopotamia competed for influence across its plains. Yet within this contested landscape, Abraham and his descendants begin forming a distinct identity, one rooted not merely in territory, but in covenant. The early patriarchal narratives describe Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob as pastoral wanderers moving between Hebron, Beersheba, and Shechem. Their world was tribal, fluid, and fragile. Power rested with local kings, while survival depended on alliances, wells, grazing land, and divine favor. These early communities were not yet a nation. They were families bound by lineage and belief. Jacob, later renamed Israel, becomes the symbolic father of the Israelites. His 12 sons would give rise to 12 tribes whose legacy would shape the region for centuries. Yet the story soon takes a dramatic turn away from Canaan. Famine, migration, and survival drive Jacob's family southward into Egypt. There, according to biblical tradition, the Israelites grow in number over generations. What begins as refuge gradually transforms into oppression. The narrative tells of forced labor under Egyptian rule and the rise of a leader who would define the earliest foundations of Israelite identity. That leader was Moses. In one of the most enduring stories in human history, Moses emerges as both prophet and revolutionary. Raised within the Egyptian court, yet born among the Hebrews, he becomes the central figure in the Exodus, the dramatic departure of the Israelites from Egypt. Whether interpreted through religious tradition, historical reconstruction, or cultural myth, the Exodus narrative holds enormous significance. It defines the Israelites not simply as a tribe, but as a people liberated from bondage and bound by law. At Mount Sinai, Moses receives the commandments that will become the foundation of Israelite religious life. The covenant forged there transforms a collection of tribes into a moral community. Law replaces chaos. Worship centers around a single deity rather than a pantheon. Identity becomes inseparable from belief. For 40 years, the Israelites wander the wilderness. The desert becomes both trial and transformation. It is there that tribal loyalties are tested, leadership struggles unfold, and a shared national story begins to take shape. But the ultimate destination remains the same land promised to Abraham centuries earlier: Canaan. By the late 2nd millennium BCE, the eastern Mediterranean world was undergoing massive upheaval. Empires were collapsing, Trade networks were fragmenting. Entire populations were migrating in what historians sometimes call the Bronze Age collapse. It is during this era of instability that the Israelites begin appearing in historical records. One of the earliest references comes from the Merneptah stele, an Egyptian monument dated to around 1208 BCE. Inscribed upon it is a brief but striking line: "Israel is laid waste, his seed is not." This single inscription reveals something crucial. By the late 13th century BCE, a group known as Israel already existed in the region of Canaan. How exactly the Israelites established themselves there remains a subject of scholarly debate. Some theories emphasize conquest. Others suggest gradual settlement by pastoral groups moving into the highlands. Archaeological evidence shows the sudden appearance of hundreds of small agricultural villages across the central hill country around this period. These settlements shared distinctive features: simple houses, communal grain storage, and the absence of pig bones, an early indicator of emerging cultural practices. Slowly, a tribal confederation began to take shape. Unlike surrounding kingdoms ruled by powerful monarchs, early Israel functioned through a decentralized system led by figures known as judges. These leaders were not kings, but charismatic warriors and arbiters who rose during times of crisis. The Book of Judges recounts cycles of conflict between the Israelites and neighboring peoples: Philistines, Moabites, Midianites, and Canaanite city-states. Each crisis threatened the fragile unity of the tribes. Each deliverance reinforced a shared narrative that survival depended on faithfulness to the covenant. Among these adversaries, one group would become particularly influential: the Philistines. Arriving along the southern coastal plain around the 12th century BCE, the Philistines were likely part of the mysterious Sea Peoples, who migrated across the Mediterranean after the collapse of older empires. They established 5 powerful cities: Gaza, Ashkelon, Ashdod, Ekron, and Gath. Unlike the hill-dwelling Israelites, the Philistines possessed advanced metallurgy, organized armies, and fortified urban centers. Their presence created constant tension along Israel's western frontier. As clashes intensified, the tribal structure of Israel began to strain under the pressure of external threats. The loose confederation of judges was no longer sufficient for survival in a region dominated by centralized states and professional armies. The tribes demanded a king. This request marked a profound transformation in Israelite society. The prophet Samuel, according to tradition, reluctantly anointed the first king, Saul. Saul's reign in the late 11th century BCE represents the birth of the Israelite monarchy. His rule united the tribes under a single authority for the first time. Yet his leadership was plagued by internal divisions and relentless warfare with the Philistines. It was during this turbulent period that a young shepherd from Bethlehem entered the historical stage: David. Originally a warrior in Saul's service, David would rise through a combination of military skill, political acumen, and personal charisma. After Saul's death, David gradually consolidated power, first ruling the southern tribe of Judah and later uniting all Israel under his crown. Around the year 1000 BCE, David captured a strategically located fortress city from the Jebusites, Jerusalem. This moment would change the destiny of the land forever. Jerusalem was uniquely positioned between the territories of the northern tribes and the southern kingdom of Judah. By making it his capital, David created a political and spiritual center that transcended tribal divisions. He also transported the Ark of the Covenant, the sacred symbol of Israel's divine covenant, to the city, transforming Jerusalem into the heart of Israelite worship. Under David's leadership, Israel expanded dramatically. Military campaigns pushed its borders outward, establishing dominance over neighboring regions including Moab, Edom, and parts of Syria. For the first time, Israel was not merely surviving, it was thriving as a regional power. Yet David's reign was not without turmoil. Internal rebellions, family betrayals, and succession crises shadowed his later years. The most famous of these revolts was led by his own son, Absalom, whose rebellion nearly tore the kingdom apart. Despite these challenges, David's legacy would endure. He had united the tribes, established Jerusalem as the capital, and laid the foundations for a dynasty that would shape Israelite identity for centuries. When David died around 970 BCE, the throne passed to his son Solomon. If David had been the warrior king, Solomon would become the builder king. Solomon inherited a unified and prosperous kingdom. During his reign, Israel entered a period of relative peace and remarkable cultural development. Trade networks expanded across the Mediterranean and into Arabia. Diplomatic alliances connected Israel to powerful neighbors, including Egypt. But Solomon's greatest achievement was architectural and spiritual: the construction of the first temple in Jerusalem. This monumental structure became the central sanctuary of Israelite worship. It housed the Ark of the Covenant and symbolized the permanent presence of the divine within the city. The temple transformed Jerusalem from a political capital into one of the most sacred cities in human history. Pilgrims, priests, and sacrifices would now define the rhythms of religious life. Festivals tied the agricultural calendar to national identity. The monarchy, priesthood, and temple became intertwined institutions shaping the destiny of the kingdom. Yet beneath the grandeur of Solomon's reign, tensions quietly simmered. Massive building projects required heavy taxation and forced labor. Regional inequalities deepened between the northern tribes and the royal court in Jerusalem. The seeds of division had already begun to take root. Within a generation of Solomon's death, the United Kingdom would fracture. The northern tribes would break away to form the Kingdom of Israel. The southern tribes would remain under the Davidic dynasty as the Kingdom of Judah. What had once been a unified monarchy would become two rival states competing for survival in a region dominated by powerful empires. And beyond their borders, a new imperial force was rising in the east: Assyria. The age of Israel's kings had only just begun, but the storm clouds of empire were already gathering. The story of this contested land was far from over. It was only entering its most dangerous chapter. The golden age of a united Israelite kingdom did not survive the generation that followed Solomon. Empires, like the lives of the men who build them, often contain the seeds of their own collapse. Solomon had created magnificent cities, expanded trade networks, and erected the first temple in Jerusalem. Yet the immense cost of these achievements weighed heavily upon the people. Taxes grew burdensome. Forced labor conscripted thousands. The northern tribes increasingly felt that the royal court in Jerusalem served the interests of Judah more than the rest of the nation. When Solomon died around 930 BCE, the fragile unity he had maintained began to unravel. His son Rehoboam ascended to the throne, expecting the loyalty of the tribes. Instead, he inherited a kingdom simmering with resentment. Delegations from the northern tribes gathered at Shechem and presented their demand: lighten the heavy burdens imposed during Solomon's reign. They did not seek rebellion. They sought relief. Rehoboam faced a defining decision. The elder advisors who had served his father counseled moderation. Reduce the taxes, they advised, and the people will remain loyal. But the younger men of the court urged the opposite. Strengthen the crown's authority. Show no weakness. Rehoboam chose the path of arrogance. He responded with a declaration that would shatter the kingdom: "My father disciplined you with whips, I will discipline you with scorpions." The reaction was immediate. The northern tribes rejected his authority and proclaimed their independence. Under the leadership of Jeroboam, a former official in Solomon's administration, they established a new state. The once united kingdom split into two rival nations. To the north emerged the Kingdom of Israel, composed of 10 tribes and centered eventually around the capital city of Samaria. To the south remained the Kingdom of Judah, ruled by the descendants of David from Jerusalem. This division would shape the destiny of the land for the next 2 centuries. What had been a unified people now lived under two competing crowns, each claiming legitimacy, each navigating a dangerous world of regional powers. The northern kingdom of Israel was larger, wealthier, and more strategically positioned along major trade routes. Fertile valleys and thriving towns gave it economic advantages over its southern neighbor. Yet the kingdom also faced internal instability. Jeroboam understood that religious loyalty to Jerusalem could undermine his authority. Pilgrimages to the temple in Judah might gradually reunite the people under the Davidic dynasty. To prevent this, he established alternative centers of worship at Bethel and Dan. Golden calves were erected as symbols of divine presence, echoing ancient traditions but provoking condemnation from prophets and later biblical writers. Politically, Israel experienced frequent coups and dynastic changes. Kings rose through military power and fell through assassination. The monarchy lacked the long-term stability that Judah maintained through its continuous Davidic lineage. Yet Israel also flourished culturally and economically during several periods, particularly under the Omride dynasty in the 9th century BCE. King Omri consolidated the kingdom and founded a new capital, Samaria. Built upon a defensible hill, the city quickly became one of the most impressive urban centers in the region. Its palaces and fortifications reflected the kingdom's growing power. Omri's son, Ahab, inherited a strong state and expanded its influence further. Through marriage to Jezebel, the daughter of the Phoenician king of Tyre, Israel secured valuable trade alliances across the Mediterranean. But the royal marriage introduced new religious tensions. Jezebel actively promoted the worship of Baal, a powerful Canaanite storm deity. Temples were constructed and priests supported by the royal court. For many Israelites, this represented a dangerous departure from exclusive devotion to the God of Israel. The resulting conflict between royal authority and prophetic resistance would become one of the defining themes of the era. No figure embodies this confrontation more dramatically than the prophet Elijah. Emerging from the rugged highlands, Elijah challenged Ahab's rule and denounced the worship of Baal. According to tradition, the confrontation reached its climax on Mount Carmel, where Elijah faced hundreds of Baal's prophets in a contest meant to demonstrate which deity held true power. The dramatic narrative describes fire descending from heaven in response to Elijah's prayer, affirming the supremacy of Israel's God. Yet despite moments of prophetic triumph, the deeper political currents of the kingdom continued to shift. Beyond Israel's borders, an even greater threat was beginning to rise. To the northeast, the Assyrian Empire was expanding with relentless ambition. Assyria possessed one of the most formidable military machines the ancient world had ever seen. Its armies marched with iron weapons, siege towers, and disciplined formations capable of crushing rebellious cities. During the 9th and 8th centuries BCE, Assyria steadily extended its reach across the Near East. Smaller kingdoms like Israel and Judah suddenly found themselves navigating the dangerous politics of imperial power. Tribute payments, shifting alliances, and occasional revolts defined their relationship with the empire. Israel, positioned closer to Assyria's frontier, felt the pressure first. By the mid-8th century BCE, internal instability once again plagued the northern kingdom. Kings were assassinated in rapid succession. Political factions debated whether to submit to Assyria or resist through alliances with neighboring states. One such coalition attempted to challenge Assyrian authority. The gamble proved disastrous. In 722 BCE, after years of conflict, the Assyrian king Shalmaneser V, and later his successor Sargon II, launched a decisive campaign against Israel. The capital city of Samaria endured a prolonged siege. When the city finally fell, the consequences were catastrophic. The kingdom of Israel ceased to exist. Assyrian policy toward conquered peoples was both ruthless and strategic. Large portions of the population were deported to distant regions of the empire, while foreign settlers were brought into the territory. The goal was clear: dismantle local identities that might fuel rebellion. The 10 tribes of the northern kingdom gradually disappeared from the historical record, giving rise to the enduring legend of the lost tribes of Israel. For the people of Judah in the south, the destruction of their northern neighbor served as both warning and trauma. Refugees from Israel flooded into Jerusalem and surrounding towns, bringing with them stories of devastation and exile. Judah suddenly found itself the last surviving remnant of the Israelite kingdoms. For a time, survival depended on submission. Judah paid tribute to Assyria and remained a loyal vassal state. Yet political pressure and religious reform movements within the kingdom would soon challenge that delicate balance. One of Judah's most influential kings, Hezekiah, ruled during the late 8th century BCE. Determined to strengthen his nation both spiritually and politically, he initiated sweeping reforms. Hezekiah centralized worship in Jerusalem, removing local shrines and emphasizing the authority of the temple. At the same time, he fortified the capital city in preparation for possible conflict with Assyria. Massive defensive walls were constructed. A remarkable engineering project carved a tunnel through solid rock to bring water from the Gihon spring safely inside Jerusalem's walls. These preparations proved necessary sooner than expected. In 701 BCE, the Assyrian king Sennacherib launched a massive campaign against rebellious territories across the Levant. His armies swept through Judah, capturing fortified cities and devastating the countryside. One of the most famous battles of this campaign occurred at Lachish, Judah's second most important city. Assyrian relief carvings discovered in the ruins of Nineveh depict the brutal siege in vivid detail: battering rams smashing walls, prisoners led away, defenders impaled. Lachish fell. Jerusalem stood next. Sennacherib surrounded the city, boasting in his inscriptions that he had trapped Hezekiah like a bird in a cage. Yet despite the overwhelming strength of the Assyrian army, Jerusalem itself was never destroyed. Historical explanations vary. Some scholars suggest plagues struck the Assyrian forces. Others believe diplomatic negotiations and tribute payments persuaded Sennacherib to withdraw. Whatever the cause, the survival of Jerusalem became a defining moment in Judah's collective memory. The kingdom endured for another century, yet the world beyond Judah continued to change. Assyria eventually declined, weakened by internal struggles and external attacks. By the late 7th century BCE, a new power had risen to replace it: Babylon. Under the ambitious king Nebuchadnezzar II, the Babylonian Empire expanded rapidly across the Near East. Former Assyrian territories fell under Babylonian control, including the lands surrounding Judah. Once again, the small kingdom found itself caught between imperial ambitions. Judah's final kings struggled to navigate this dangerous landscape. Some favored submission to Babylon. Others believed rebellion might secure independence, especially with potential support from Egypt. These competing visions ultimately led to catastrophe. In 597 BCE, Babylonian forces marched into Judah and captured Jerusalem. King Jehoiachin was taken into exile along with many members of the elite population. A puppet king, Zedekiah, was installed to rule under Babylonian authority, but rebellion soon returned. Encouraged by Egyptian diplomacy and internal nationalist factions, Zedekiah defied Babylon's rule. The response from Nebuchadnezzar was swift and merciless. In 586 BCE, Babylonian armies once again surrounded Jerusalem. The siege lasted months. Famine spread within the city walls. Desperation consumed the population. Finally, Babylonian forces breached the defenses. Jerusalem was destroyed. The first temple, the Sacred Heart of Israelite worship built by Solomon nearly 4 centuries earlier, was burned to the ground. The Davidic monarchy collapsed. Large portions of the population were deported to Babylon, marking the beginning of one of the most transformative periods in Jewish history. The Babylonian exile. The people who had once built kingdoms in Canaan now faced life as exiles in a foreign land. Yet exile would not destroy their identity. Instead, it would reshape it. The next chapter of Israel's history would unfold not only in ruined cities and distant rivers, but in the struggle to preserve memory, faith, and hope far from the land they once called home. When Jerusalem fell in 586 BCE, it was not merely the destruction of a city. It was the collapse of a worldview. For centuries, the people of Judah had believed that their capital, home to the sacred temple of Solomon and the throne of David, stood under divine protection. Empires had threatened it before, but the city had survived. The Babylonian destruction shattered that assumption forever. Nebuchadnezzar II's armies left the city in ruins. The temple that had defined Israelite worship was burned, its treasures looted, its sacred vessels carried away to Babylon. The royal palace lay in ashes. Defensive walls were torn down. The once bustling streets of Jerusalem became silent. For those who survived, the trauma was overwhelming. Thousands of Judah's political leaders, priests, craftsmen, and educated elites were deported to Babylon. The exile was not simply a punishment. It was a deliberate imperial strategy. By removing the leadership class, Babylon weakened the possibility of rebellion in conquered territories. Those who remained in Judah lived among devastation. Agricultural land had been ravaged. Many towns were abandoned. The political structure of the kingdom had vanished. Yet history's most remarkable transformations often arise from catastrophe. In Babylon, the exiled community faced an existential question. How could they preserve their identity when everything that once defined it had been destroyed? The temple was gone. The monarchy had ended. The land promised to their ancestors was no longer theirs. What remained? The answer would reshape Jewish history forever. Exile forced the community to redefine what it meant to be a people. In Babylon, they could not rely on temple rituals or royal authority. Instead, they turned increasingly to sacred texts, law, and collective memory. Prophets such as Ezekiel and Jeremiah became central voices during this crisis. Their writings struggled to interpret the disaster. Had God abandoned Israel, or had the people abandoned their covenant? Ezekiel, himself among the exiles in Babylon, described visions of divine presence that were no longer confined to the destroyed temple. God, he declared, could be encountered even in a foreign land. This theological shift was revolutionary. If divine presence was not limited to Jerusalem, then faith could survive exile. Meanwhile, scribes began preserving and compiling traditions that had previously circulated orally or in scattered written forms. Laws, historical narratives, and prophetic writings gradually took shape as the early foundations of the Hebrew Bible. The community gathered to read these texts, discuss them, and pass them to future generations. What emerged during this period was a new form of religious life centered on scripture and communal worship rather than temple sacrifice alone. In many ways, the foundations of Judaism as it would later be known were born in exile. The Babylonians, however, would not rule forever. To the east, a new power was rising that would transform the political landscape of the ancient world. The Persian Empire, led by an ambitious ruler named Cyrus the Great, was expanding rapidly across Asia. In 539 BCE, Cyrus's armies captured Babylon with astonishing speed. The mighty city that had conquered Jerusalem less than 50 years earlier fell almost without resistance. The shift in imperial rule brought an unexpected opportunity for the exiled Judeans. Unlike the Babylonians, Persian policy toward conquered peoples emphasized stability through cultural autonomy. Rather than forcibly relocating populations, Cyrus often allowed displaced communities to return to their ancestral lands and rebuild local religious institutions. Shortly after taking Babylon, Cyrus issued a decree permitting the Judean exiles to return to Jerusalem and reconstruct their temple. For the descendants of the exiles, the announcement carried enormous significance. The promise of restoration, dreamed of by prophets during the darkest days of exile, was suddenly becoming reality. Yet returning home was not simple. Decades had passed since Jerusalem's destruction. Entire generations had been born in Babylon. Some families had built new lives, businesses, and communities there. The journey back to Judah meant abandoning stability for uncertainty. Only a portion of the exiled population chose to return. The first major group made the long journey west around 538 BCE, led by a leader named Zerubbabel, who was himself a descendant of the Davidic royal line. When the returning exiles arrived in Jerusalem, the reality they encountered was sobering. The city remained largely in ruins. The temple site was a field of rubble. Agricultural lands required restoration. Surrounding regions were inhabited by populations that had settled there during the decades of exile. These communities included people of mixed ancestry, descendants of those left behind after the Babylonian conquest, as well as groups resettled by imperial authorities. Their religious practices blended elements of Israelite tradition with local customs. Tensions soon emerged between the returning exiles and these local inhabitants. The returning community saw themselves as the rightful heirs of Israel's covenant and traditions. They sought to rebuild religious life according to the laws and customs preserved during exile. Local populations, however, viewed themselves as legitimate residents of the land with their own claims and practices. This conflict would influence the region's politics for centuries. Despite these challenges, reconstruction began. The first priority was rebuilding the temple. Work on the foundation started with ceremonies filled with both joy and sorrow. According to ancient accounts, older members of the community who remembered Solomon's temple wept when they saw how modest the new structure would be in comparison. Nevertheless, the Second Temple was completed around 516 BCE. Though smaller and less magnificent than its predecessor, it restored Jerusalem as the spiritual center of Jewish life. The Persian Empire governed the region through a system of provinces, and Judah became part of a larger administrative district known as Yehud. Local leaders operated under Persian authority while maintaining a degree of religious autonomy. Two influential figures would play key roles in shaping the post-exilic community: Ezra and Nehemiah. Ezra, a priest and scribe who arrived from Babylon in the 5th century BCE, focused on restoring religious discipline and knowledge of the law. He publicly read the Torah to assembled crowds in Jerusalem, reaffirming the central role of Scripture in Jewish life. Nehemiah, serving as a governor under Persian authority, undertook a different mission. Jerusalem still lacked adequate defenses decades after the exile. Nehemiah organized the rebuilding of the city walls, transforming Jerusalem from a vulnerable settlement into a fortified urban center once again. The reconstruction of the walls was both practical and symbolic. It signaled that Jerusalem had returned as a functioning city. Under Persian rule, Judah remained relatively small and politically modest compared to its former kingdoms. Yet the religious and cultural identity of the Jewish people grew stronger during this period. Communal institutions developed, priestly leadership expanded, pilgrimages to the temple resumed. The rhythms of religious festivals once again shaped the calendar of the people. But the wider world was changing again. In the 4th century BCE, the Persian Empire, once the largest empire the world had ever seen, began facing a new and unstoppable challenger from the West. His name was Alexander. Alexander of Macedon, later known as Alexander the Great, launched a sweeping campaign against Persia beginning in 334 BCE. Within a decade, his armies had conquered vast territories stretching from Greece to Egypt and deep into Asia. In 332 BCE, Alexander marched through the eastern Mediterranean and entered the lands of Judah. For the Jewish population, Persian rule had lasted nearly 2 centuries. Now a new empire had arrived, one that would introduce powerful cultural forces that would reshape the region's identity in unexpected ways. Greek language, philosophy, and political ideas spread rapidly throughout Alexander's empire in a process historians call Hellenization. Cities were redesigned with Greek architecture. Greek became the language of commerce and administration. Athletic competitions, theaters, and philosophical schools appeared across the eastern Mediterranean. After Alexander's sudden death in 323 BCE, his empire fragmented into competing kingdoms ruled by his former generals. Judah became caught between two of these successor states, the Ptolemaic dynasty ruling Egypt and the Seleucid dynasty ruling Syria and much of Asia. For decades, control of the region shifted between these rival powers. Under the early Ptolemaic rulers, Jewish communities generally enjoyed religious freedom and relative stability. Many Jews migrated to cities across the Mediterranean, particularly Alexandria in Egypt, where one of the largest Jewish communities outside Judea developed. It was in this diaspora environment that Jewish scholars translated the Hebrew scriptures into Greek, producing a version known as the Septuagint. This translation allowed Jewish traditions to interact with the wider Greek-speaking world. Yet the cultural encounter between Hellenistic civilization and Jewish religious tradition also created tensions. Some Jews embraced aspects of Greek culture, language, dress, education, and philosophy. Others saw these influences as a threat to the covenant and religious law that defined their identity. This internal struggle over cultural assimilation would eventually erupt into open conflict. By the early 2nd century BCE, the Seleucid Empire had gained control of Judea. Under one particular ruler, Antiochus IV Epiphanes, tensions reached a breaking point. Antiochus sought to strengthen imperial unity by enforcing elements of Greek religious practice throughout his territories. In Jerusalem, he interfered directly in temple affairs, appointing high priests aligned with Hellenistic policies. Then, in a shocking move, Antiochus outlawed key Jewish religious practices. Circumcision was banned. Observance of the Sabbath was prohibited. Possession of the Torah became punishable by death. Worst of all, the Jerusalem temple itself was desecrated, reportedly rededicated to the Greek god Zeus. For many Jews, these actions represented an unbearable assault on their faith and identity. Resistance began in a small rural village. From that spark, a rebellion would ignite that changed the course of Jewish history and restored Jewish sovereignty to the land for the first time in centuries. In the hills of Judea, where terraced farms clung to rocky slopes and ancient olive trees twisted beneath the sun, resistance began quietly. The Seleucid Empire under Antiochus IV Epiphanes had attempted something unprecedented in Jewish history: the systematic eradication of Jewish religious life. To Antiochus, it was an act of imperial policy designed to strengthen unity within his diverse empire. To the Jewish population of Judea, it was an existential threat. When imperial officials arrived in the small village of Modin around 167 BCE to enforce the king's decrees, they demanded that the villagers perform a public sacrifice to Greek gods. It was meant to demonstrate loyalty to the Seleucid state and obedience to Hellenistic religious norms. Standing before the altar was an elderly priest named Mattathias of the Hasmonean family. Mattathias was not a king, nor a general. He was a rural priest devoted to the traditions that had defined Jewish life for centuries. But when another villager stepped forward to perform the demanded sacrifice, Mattathias reacted with sudden fury. According to historical accounts preserved in later Jewish texts, he struck down both the collaborator and the Seleucid official overseeing the ritual. Then he shouted a call that would echo through Jewish history. "Let everyone who is zealous for the law and supports the covenant follow me." With that declaration, Mattathias and his 5 sons fled into the surrounding hills. What began as an act of defiance in a small village would soon ignite a full-scale revolt. The rebellion that followed would become known as the Maccabean Revolt. At first, the resistance movement consisted of small bands of fighters hiding in the Judean wilderness. They relied on intimate knowledge of the terrain, launching surprise attacks against Seleucid forces and collaborators. Mattathias did not live long after the rebellion began. Leadership soon passed to his son Judah, whose battlefield successes would earn him a legendary nickname, Judah Maccabee. The name Maccabee, meaning the hammer, reflected both his ferocity in battle and his symbolic role as the hammer striking against imperial oppression. Under Judah's leadership, the rebellion transformed from scattered resistance into an organized military campaign. Guerrilla tactics allowed the rebels to defeat larger Seleucid forces in several early engagements. These victories electrified the population. Many Jews who had initially feared opposing the empire now joined the rebellion. The movement grew not only as a military uprising, but as a religious crusade aimed at restoring the sanctity of Jewish law and worship. The Seleucid Empire initially underestimated the revolt. Antiochus was preoccupied with campaigns in the eastern parts of his empire and delegated suppression of the uprising to regional generals. But the rebels continued winning battles. Judah Maccabee proved to be a brilliant and adaptable commander. His forces defeated Seleucid armies at Beit Horon, Emmaus, and Beit Zur, gradually gaining control of much of the Judean countryside. These victories culminated in one of the most significant moments in Jewish history. In 164 BCE, the Maccabean rebels entered Jerusalem. The city they reclaimed was deeply scarred by years of conflict and foreign control. The temple, once the sacred center of Jewish worship, had been desecrated. Pagan altars stood where Jewish sacrifices had once been offered. Judah and his followers immediately began purifying the temple. According to Jewish tradition, they cleansed the sanctuary, rebuilt the altar, and prepared to restore proper worship. Yet they faced a symbolic problem. Only a small amount of consecrated oil remained for lighting the temple's menorah. The supply was enough to burn for a single day, but tradition records that the flame miraculously lasted for 8 days, long enough for new consecrated oil to be prepared. This event became the foundation of the Jewish festival of Hanukkah, commemorating the rededication of the temple and the resilience of Jewish faith during a time of persecution. Despite the recapture of Jerusalem, the war was not over. The Seleucid Empire launched further campaigns to regain control of Judea. Judah Maccabee continued leading the resistance, achieving several additional victories. But the rebels faced enormous challenges. The Seleucid military remained powerful, and internal divisions occasionally weakened the rebellion. In 160 BCE, Judah Maccabee was killed in battle against a Seleucid army. His death could have ended the revolt. Instead, leadership passed to his brothers, first Jonathan and later Simon, who continued the struggle with both military and diplomatic strategies. Over the next 2 decades, the Seleucid Empire became increasingly weakened by internal conflicts and external wars. Rival claimants to the throne competed for power, giving the Jewish rebels opportunities to negotiate greater autonomy. Jonathan secured recognition as High Priest of Jerusalem, while maintaining political alliances with various Seleucid factions. His brother Simon would eventually achieve something even more remarkable. In 142 BCE, Simon successfully negotiated the removal of Seleucid garrisons from Jerusalem. The Jewish people effectively regained political independence. For the first time since the Babylonian conquest nearly 4 centuries earlier, Judea once again became a sovereign Jewish state. The ruling family, descendants of Mattathias, became known as the Hasmonean dynasty. Unlike the earlier Davidic kings, the Hasmoneans combined both religious and political authority. The high priesthood and kingship were now intertwined in the same ruling house. This fusion of sacred and secular leadership was controversial even among Jews themselves. Some believed only descendants of King David should rule as monarchs. Nevertheless, the Hasmonean kingdom expanded rapidly. Under rulers such as John Hyrcanus and Alexander Jannaeus, the state grew far beyond the original borders of Judea. Military campaigns extended control into Samaria, Galilee, Idumea, and parts of the Transjordan. These expansions created a regional power that had not existed since the days of the ancient Israelite monarchy. Yet conquest brought its own challenges. Many of the territories absorbed into the Hasmonean kingdom contained populations with different ethnic and religious traditions. The ruling dynasty often attempted to integrate these groups through forced conversion or political assimilation. This policy produced long-term tensions within the region. Internally, Jewish society also experienced ideological divisions. Various religious movements emerged with competing visions of how Jewish law and tradition should be interpreted. Among these groups were the Pharisees and the Sadducees. The Pharisees emphasized strict adherence to religious law and traditions developed through scholarly interpretation. They believed that religious practice should extend into everyday life beyond the temple. The Sadducees, by contrast, were often associated with the priestly elite and temple leadership. They tended to emphasize the authority of the written law and maintained close ties with the political establishment. These debates reflected deeper questions about identity, authority, and the future direction of Jewish society. Meanwhile, the broader Mediterranean world was undergoing dramatic transformation. A new power was rising in the West. Rome, what had once been a small city-state on the Italian peninsula, had gradually expanded into a formidable republic controlling vast territories across the Mediterranean. Roman armies defeated rivals such as Carthage and Macedonia, establishing dominance over trade routes and political alliances. By the 2nd century BCE, Rome had become the most powerful state in the Mediterranean world. The Hasmonean rulers initially sought diplomatic relations with Rome as a strategic safeguard against neighboring empires. Treaties were signed establishing friendship between the two powers. At first, Roman influence seemed distant, but as Roman power continued expanding eastward, the political independence of smaller kingdoms like Judea became increasingly fragile. Within the Hasmonean dynasty itself, internal rivalries began undermining the stability that earlier generations had fought so hard to achieve. Succession disputes erupted between rival claimants to the throne. Brothers fought brothers. Alliances with foreign powers were sought in order to gain advantage in these internal struggles. These conflicts eventually invited Roman intervention. In 63 BCE, the Roman general Pompey marched into the region during a broader campaign to reorganize eastern Mediterranean territories under Roman influence. Rival Hasmonean leaders both appealed to Pompey for support in their struggle for power. The Roman general arrived in Jerusalem not merely as a mediator, but as a conqueror. After a brief siege, Roman forces captured the city. Pompey entered the temple itself, an act that shocked many Jews, as the sacred sanctuary was meant to be accessible only to the high priest. Although Pompey did not destroy the temple, his actions symbolized a profound shift in political reality. Judea was no longer an independent kingdom. It became a client state under Roman authority. The Hasmonean dynasty would continue to rule for a time, but only under the supervision and approval of Rome. The autonomy achieved through the sacrifices of the Maccabean revolt had lasted less than a century. A new era had begun. Roman governance would reshape the political landscape of the region, bringing both stability and tension. Local rulers would depend on Roman favor. Heavy taxation would support imperial administration. At the same time, Jewish religious identity, hardened by centuries of exile, persecution, and resistance, remained fiercely committed to its traditions. These forces were destined to collide. Within a few decades, Rome would appoint a new ruler over Judea, one whose name would become forever linked with both monumental construction and deep political controversy: Herod. Under his rule, Jerusalem would undergo dramatic transformation, including the rebuilding of the temple on a scale greater than ever before. But Herod's reign would also deepen tensions between imperial authority and Jewish religious expectations. And within that volatile world, a movement would emerge whose influence would extend far beyond the borders of Judea. The next chapter of this contested land would unfold under the shadow of Rome, and the birth of a religious revolution that would reshape global history. When Roman general Pompey entered Jerusalem in 63 BCE, the political independence of Judea effectively ended. The once sovereign Hasmonean kingdom became another territory within the expanding orbit of Roman power. Rome did not always rule conquered lands directly. Instead, it often governed through client kings, local rulers who maintained authority as long as they remained loyal to the empire. Judea soon received such a ruler. His name was Herod. Herod the Great was not born into the ancient royal lines of Israel. He was the son of Antipater, an Idumean political figure who had risen to influence under the Hasmonean kings. Through skillful diplomacy with Rome, Antipater secured powerful connections that placed his family at the center of regional politics. When civil war erupted within the Roman Republic between Julius Caesar's supporters and his enemies, Antipater sided with Caesar and provided military assistance. The decision proved wise. Caesar rewarded Antipater's loyalty by appointing him procurator of Judea. This position allowed Antipater to install his sons in important roles. Herod was appointed governor of Galilee while still a young man. Herod quickly demonstrated his ambition and ruthlessness. When a local rebellion broke out in Galilee, he crushed it with brutal efficiency, executing suspected insurgents without waiting for trial. The decisive action impressed Roman authorities but alarmed many Jewish leaders who viewed Herod's methods as excessive. Despite criticism, Herod's career continued rising. In 40 BCE, a major crisis shook the region. The Parthian Empire, Rome's powerful eastern rival, launched an invasion into Syria and Judea. Parthian forces installed a Hasmonean prince named Antigonus as king, forcing Herod to flee. Rather than surrender his ambitions, Herod traveled to Rome. There, he presented his case to the Roman Senate. With the support of powerful Roman leaders such as Mark Antony and Octavian, Herod achieved an extraordinary outcome. The Roman Senate declared him King of the Jews. With Roman military backing, Herod returned to Judea and launched a campaign to reclaim the territory from the Parthians and their local allies. After several years of fighting, he captured Jerusalem in 37 BCE. Antigonus was executed. Herod now ruled Judea as Rome's chosen king. Yet Herod's position remained precarious from the beginning. To Rome, he was a loyal client king. To many Jews, he was an outsider, an Idumean ruler imposed by a foreign empire. His legitimacy rested not on ancient lineage or popular support but on Roman power. Herod understood the dangers of his position. He ruled through a combination of political calculation, grand ambition, and ruthless control. One of his most effective strategies was monumental construction. Herod launched one of the most ambitious building programs in the ancient Near East. Massive projects transformed the landscape of Judea and surrounding territories. Cities were rebuilt. Fortresses rose on desert cliffs. Ports were constructed along the Mediterranean coast. The most famous of these projects was the reconstruction of the Jerusalem Temple. The second temple built by returning exiles centuries earlier was modest compared to Solomon's original structure. Herod envisioned something far more magnificent, an architectural project that would rival the greatest monuments of the Roman world. Beginning around 20 BCE, Herod ordered the temple complex to be dramatically expanded. Engineers reshaped the hilltop of Jerusalem by constructing enormous retaining walls, creating a vast platform that could support an expanded temple courtyard. The project required thousands of workers and enormous quantities of stone. The temple itself was rebuilt with white limestone blocks that gleamed in the sunlight. Surrounding courtyards could accommodate tens of thousands of worshippers during religious festivals. Even critics of Herod acknowledged the breathtaking scale of the achievement. The temple complex became one of the most impressive religious structures in the ancient world. But Herod's reign was not defined by construction alone. Fear and paranoia shaped much of his rule. The king was constantly aware that his authority depended on Roman support and fragile political alliances. Suspected conspiracies were crushed with ruthless efficiency. Even members of his own family were not spared. Herod executed several of his wives and sons after accusing them of plotting against him. Ancient historians recorded that the Roman Emperor Augustus once joked that it was safer to be Herod's pig than his son. Despite these brutal actions, Herod maintained relative stability in the region for decades. He balanced Roman expectations with local traditions, allowing Jewish religious practices to continue while ensuring loyalty to Rome. But when Herod died in 4 BCE, the delicate balance he had maintained began to collapse. Rome divided Herod's kingdom among several of his sons. Herod Archelaus received Judea, Samaria, and Idumea. However, his rule quickly became unpopular due to harsh policies and administrative failures. After repeated complaints from the population, Rome removed him from power in 6 CE. Instead of appointing another local king, Rome reorganized Judea as a province governed directly by Roman officials known as prefects or procurators. These governors answered to the Roman authorities in Syria and ultimately to the emperor himself. Roman rule brought new administrative systems, taxation policies, and military oversight. For many Jews, however, Roman governance represented a humiliating loss of autonomy. The presence of Roman soldiers in the land, once promised to their ancestors, created deep resentment. Religious sensitivities often clashed with Roman political practices. Roman standards bearing imperial images sometimes entered Jerusalem, offending Jewish prohibitions against graven images. Taxation policies placed economic pressure on rural populations. Occasional acts of Roman insensitivity toward temple practices inflamed tensions. Yet daily life in Judea continued with remarkable complexity. The temple in Jerusalem remained the spiritual heart of Jewish society. Pilgrims traveled from across the region during major festivals such as Passover, Shavuot, and Sukkot. Priests conducted elaborate rituals, sacrifices, and prayers. Beyond Jerusalem, Jewish communities flourished in towns and villages throughout Galilee and Judea. At the same time, Jewish populations were spread widely across the Mediterranean world. Large diaspora communities existed in cities such as Alexandria, Antioch, and Rome itself. Within Judea, diverse religious movements continued shaping Jewish thought. The Pharisees emphasized interpretation of the law and traditions guiding everyday life. The Sadducees maintained strong connections to the temple priesthood and aristocratic leadership. Another group known as the Essenes withdrew from mainstream society, forming communal settlements such as the one at Qumran near the Dead Sea. They devoted themselves to strict religious discipline and apocalyptic expectations about the coming transformation of the world. Amid this complex religious landscape, many Jews shared a growing hope. They believed that God would eventually send a Messiah, a divinely chosen leader who would restore justice, defeat foreign oppression, and renew the kingdom of Israel. Expectations about this figure varied. Some imagined a warrior king like David. Others envisioned a priestly reformer or prophetic teacher. In the early 1st century CE, a preacher from the Galilean countryside began attracting attention. His name was Jesus of Nazareth. Jesus traveled through villages and towns teaching about repentance, compassion, and the approaching kingdom of God. His message drew large crowds, particularly among the poor and marginalized. Many listeners interpreted his teachings through the lens of messianic hope. To Roman authorities and the temple leadership in Jerusalem, however, any movement that attracted mass followings carried potential political risk. During the Roman governorship of Pontius Pilate, Jesus traveled to Jerusalem during the Passover festival, a time when the city swelled with pilgrims and tensions often ran high. According to early Christian accounts, Jesus entered the city to enthusiastic crowds, but soon faced accusations of challenging both religious authorities and Roman order. He was arrested, tried, and ultimately executed by crucifixion, a punishment commonly used by Rome against rebels and criminals. At the time, the execution may have appeared as a routine suppression of a potential troublemaker. Yet the impact of Jesus' life and teachings would extend far beyond that moment. His followers soon proclaimed that he had risen from the dead and was indeed the promised Messiah. What began as a small Jewish movement gradually spread across the Roman world, eventually developing into the religion now known as Christianity. For Judea itself, however, tensions with Roman rule continued escalating. Economic hardships, religious disputes, and growing nationalist sentiment fueled resentment toward imperial authority. Radical groups began advocating armed resistance against Rome. One such movement, known as the Zealots, believed that Jewish freedom could only be achieved through rebellion. By the middle of the 1st century CE, Judea stood on the edge of a massive confrontation. Rome possessed the greatest military force in the ancient world. But history had already shown that the people of this land were willing to fight for their faith, identity, and autonomy. Within a generation of Jesus' death, that confrontation would erupt into a devastating war, one that would once again destroy Jerusalem and transform Jewish history forever. By the middle of the 1st century CE, the tension between Roman authority and Jewish identity in Judea had reached a dangerous boiling point. For decades, the relationship between the local population and the imperial administration had been strained but manageable. Roman governors maintained order, collected taxes, and ensured loyalty to the empire. In return, Jewish religious life was generally allowed to continue, centered around the temple in Jerusalem. But beneath this fragile arrangement, anger was steadily growing. Roman taxation placed heavy burdens on rural farmers already struggling with poor harvests and debt. Wealth increasingly concentrated in the hands of elite families connected to the temple priesthood and Roman administration. Many ordinary people felt trapped between imperial demands and local aristocratic power. Religious sensitivities also fueled resentment. Roman symbols and imperial images occasionally appeared in ways that violated Jewish prohibitions against idolatry. Even minor incidents could spark outrage among a population deeply committed to the sanctity of their traditions. Meanwhile, revolutionary ideas were spreading. Groups known as Zealots believed that loyalty to God required resistance against foreign rule. They argued that no earthly empire had the right to govern the land promised to Israel's ancestors. Some zealots formed militant factions, prepared to use violence against Roman officials and collaborators. One particularly radical group became known as the Sicarii, named after the small daggers they concealed beneath their clothing. These assassins carried out targeted killings in crowded public spaces, striking fear into those seen as supporters of Roman authority. Roman governors often responded harshly to unrest, executing suspected rebels and suppressing disturbances with military force. Each cycle of violence deepened hostility. The spark that ignited open rebellion came in 66 CE. The immediate cause involved a dispute over temple funds. The Roman governor Gessius Florus demanded large sums from the temple treasury, claiming it was owed to the imperial administration. When Jewish leaders protested, Florus responded by sending troops into Jerusalem. Violence erupted. Roman soldiers clashed with residents in the streets. Hundreds were killed. The situation quickly spiraled out of control. Rebel factions seized control of Jerusalem and expelled the Roman garrison stationed there. In a dramatic act of defiance, insurgents stopped offering the daily sacrifices traditionally made on behalf of the Roman emperor. For Rome, this act was nothing less than open rebellion. The First Jewish-Roman War had begun. Initial successes emboldened the rebels. Jewish forces defeated a Roman legion in the region of Beit Horon, a stunning victory that shocked the empire. News of the defeat spread quickly across Roman territories. Rome could not tolerate such defiance. The Emperor Nero ordered a massive military response. Command of the campaign was given to an experienced general named Vespasian, who marched into Judea with 3 Roman legions supported by auxiliary forces. Vespasian approached the conflict with systematic precision. Rather than attacking Jerusalem immediately, he first secured control over the surrounding regions. Town after town in Galilee and northern Judea fell to Roman forces. One of the most notable defenders in Galilee was a Jewish commander named Joseph ben Mattatyahu, later known to history as Flavius Josephus. Josephus attempted to organize resistance in the city of Yodfat. After a prolonged siege, Roman troops eventually captured the fortress. According to his own later writings, Josephus survived by surrendering and predicting that Vespasian would become emperor of Rome. Remarkably, the prophecy seemed to come true. In 68 CE, political chaos erupted within the Roman Empire following Nero's death. Multiple claimants fought for control of the throne during a year of civil war known as the Year of the Four Emperors. Vespasian's troops eventually proclaimed him emperor. He left the Judean campaign in the hands of his son Titus and traveled to Rome to secure power. While Roman politics unfolded in the West, Judea descended into internal chaos. The rebel movement inside Jerusalem was deeply divided. Different factions fought not only against Rome, but also against one another. Rival leaders struggled for control of the city, leading to brutal internal conflicts. Food supplies dwindled as fighting disrupted normal trade and agriculture. By the time Roman forces prepared their final assault, Jerusalem was already weakened by months of internal violence. In the spring of 70 CE, Titus marched toward Jerusalem with 4 Roman legions. The city was crowded with pilgrims who had arrived to celebrate Passover, one of the most important festivals in the Jewish calendar. What should have been a time of religious celebration became the beginning of a devastating siege. Roman armies surrounded the city and began constructing siege works. Jerusalem was protected by formidable walls built during earlier generations, including major expansions under Herod the Great. The defenders fought fiercely from towers and battlements, yet the Roman military machine was relentless. Siege towers rolled forward. Battering rams pounded against the gates. Archers and artillery bombarded defenders from a distance. Roman soldiers gradually breached the outer defenses and advanced toward the heart of the city. Inside the walls, conditions deteriorated rapidly. Food shortages became severe. Starvation spread among the population. Desperation drove some people to unimaginable acts in order to survive. Josephus, who accompanied the Roman forces as an interpreter and historian, later described scenes of suffering that shocked even hardened soldiers. Despite the devastation, rebel factions continued fighting both the Romans and each other. Eventually, Roman troops broke through the final defensive walls and reached the temple complex. The temple had stood at the center of Jewish life for centuries. Rebuilt by Herod into one of the most magnificent religious structures in the ancient world, It symbolized both faith and national identity. During the final assault, fires broke out within the temple compound. Ancient accounts differ on whether Roman soldiers deliberately burned the temple or whether the destruction occurred accidentally during the chaos of battle. What is certain is that the result was catastrophic. The Second Temple was destroyed in August of 70 CE. Flames consumed the sanctuary. Precious artifacts were looted. The massive complex that had defined Jewish religious life for generations collapsed into ruins. For the Jewish people, the destruction of the temple represented an unimaginable tragedy. It was the second time their central sanctuary had been destroyed by a foreign empire. Jerusalem itself was devastated. Large portions of the city were burned or dismantled. Survivors were killed, enslaved, or scattered across the Roman world. The triumph was commemorated in Rome itself. The Arch of Titus, still standing today, depicts Roman soldiers carrying sacred objects from the Jerusalem temple, including the Great Menorah, through the streets of the imperial capital. Yet despite the destruction, resistance did not end immediately. Several strongholds remained under rebel control, the most famous of which was Masada. Masada was a fortress built by Herod on a plateau overlooking the Dead Sea. Surrounded by steep cliffs and fortified walls, it seemed almost impossible to capture. A group of Jewish rebels led by Aliza ben Yair took refuge there after the fall of Jerusalem. For 3 years they held out against Roman forces. Finally, in 73 CE, the Roman governor Lucius Flavius Silva surrounded Masada with thousands of soldiers. Roman engineers constructed a massive ramp of earth and stone up the side of the plateau, allowing siege engines to reach the fortress walls. As Roman troops prepared to break through, the defenders faced a final decision. According to Josephus's account, the rebels chose death over surrender. Families gathered as leaders spoke of freedom and dignity. In a tragic ritual, men reportedly killed their own families and then one another until only a single survivor remained to take his own life. When Roman soldiers finally entered the fortress, they found silence. Masada had fallen. With its fall, organized Jewish resistance to Rome ended. The consequences of the war were profound. Jerusalem was transformed into a Roman military site. Jewish presence in the city diminished dramatically. The temple, once the heart of religious life, no longer existed. Without the temple, Judaism faced another defining transformation. Priests could no longer perform sacrifices. Pilgrimages to Jerusalem lost their central purpose. Religious life had to adapt once again to a world without its sacred center. In the decades that followed, Jewish scholars known as rabbis began shaping a new model of religious practice. Instead of temple sacrifices, prayer, study, and interpretation of sacred law became the core of Jewish life. Communities gathered in synagogues rather than temple courts. This rabbinic tradition would preserve Jewish identity through centuries of dispersion. Yet resentment against Roman rule remained strong. Within 60 years of Jerusalem's destruction, another uprising would erupt, one even more ambitious and devastating than the first. Its leader would be hailed by some as the long-awaited Messiah, and the consequences would permanently alter the relationship between the Jewish people and their ancestral land. The destruction of Jerusalem in 70 CE marked one of the most devastating turning points in Jewish history. The temple had been the heart of religious life, the focal point of national identity, and the symbolic center of the covenant between the Jewish people and their God. With its destruction, many believed the Jewish world itself might collapse, yet it did not. Instead, Jewish life adapted with remarkable resilience. In the years following the Roman victory, surviving Jewish scholars gathered in the coastal town of Yavne under the leadership of Rabbi Yohanan ben Zakkai. According to tradition, Yohanan had escaped the besieged city of Jerusalem during the war and later secured permission from Roman authorities to establish a center of learning. At Yavne, the foundations of rabbinic Judaism were laid. Without a temple, religious life had to be reimagined. Sacrificial rituals were replaced with prayer, study, and observance of the law. Synagogues became centers of worship and community life. Scholars preserved and debated the traditions that would eventually be compiled into the Mishnah, a foundational text of Jewish law. Through this transformation, Judaism survived the loss of its sacred center. But survival did not mean peace. The Roman Empire remained firmly in control of Judea, which had been reorganized as part of a larger Roman province. Roman military presence in the region remained strong, and the memory of rebellion made imperial authorities wary of renewed unrest. Meanwhile, Jewish communities across the Mediterranean continued growing. Large populations lived in Egypt, Syria, Asia Minor, and Rome itself. These diaspora communities maintained connections with the land of Judea through pilgrimage, religious scholarship, and cultural memory. Tensions occasionally flared beyond Judea's borders. Between 115 and 117 CE, during the reign of Emperor Trajan, Jewish uprisings erupted in several parts of the Roman Empire, including Cyrene in North Africa, Egypt, and Cyprus. These revolts, known as the Kitos War, were violently suppressed by Roman forces. Although these uprisings occurred outside Judea, they demonstrated that resentment toward Roman rule remained widespread among Jewish populations. Back in Judea itself, conditions were relatively quiet for several decades following the destruction of Jerusalem. But beneath the surface, hopes for restoration endured. Many Jews continued believing that a messianic leader would one day arise to liberate their people and rebuild the temple. Prophetic traditions describing a future redemption remained powerful sources of hope. The stage for another uprising was set during the reign of the Roman Emperor Hadrian. Hadrian was one of Rome's most capable rulers, known for his efforts to consolidate and stabilize the empire rather than expand it. He traveled extensively through the provinces, overseeing building projects and administrative reforms. When Hadrian visited Judea around 130 CE, he initially appeared interested in rebuilding Jerusalem as a prosperous Roman city. But the details of his plan would ignite one of the most catastrophic rebellions in Jewish history. Hadrian intended to transform Jerusalem into a Roman colony called Aelia Capitolina. The new city would include temples dedicated to Roman gods, particularly Jupiter. The site where the Jewish temple had once stood would now host a pagan sanctuary. To many Jews, this proposal represented an unbearable desecration. Adding to the outrage were reports that Hadrian planned to restrict or ban certain Jewish practices, including circumcision, which Romans sometimes viewed as a form of bodily mutilation. These developments ignited anger across Judea. From this atmosphere of resentment emerged a charismatic leader named Simon Bar Kokhba. Many of his followers soon began calling him Bar Kokhba, meaning son of the star, referencing a prophetic passage interpreted by some as predicting the rise of a messianic deliverer. Bar Kokhba proved to be an extraordinary military organizer. He rallied fighters across Judea, uniting them into a disciplined rebel force. Networks of caves and underground passages were prepared throughout the countryside to support guerrilla warfare. In 132 CE, the rebellion erupted. Jewish forces launched coordinated attacks against Roman garrisons and settlements across the region. The uprising spread rapidly, overwhelming Roman defenses in several areas. For a time, the rebels achieved remarkable success. They captured large portions of Judea, including Jerusalem itself. Coins minted during the revolt declared the restoration of Israel and celebrated the freedom of Jerusalem. Bar Kokhba established a provisional government, administering the territories under rebel control. For the first time since the Roman conquest nearly 2 centuries earlier, Jewish rebels once again governed their ancestral land. Many Jews believed the long-awaited redemption had arrived, but Rome would not tolerate such a challenge. The Emperor Hadrian responded with overwhelming force. Rather than relying solely on local Roman legions, he summoned experienced generals and reinforcements from across the empire. One of Rome's most skilled commanders, Sextus Julius Severus, was brought from Britain to lead the campaign. The Roman strategy was methodical and relentless. Instead of rushing into direct confrontation with the rebels' fortified positions, Roman forces gradually recaptured territory, isolating pockets of resistance and cutting off supply routes. Battles raged across the Judean countryside. The rebels fought fiercely, using hidden tunnels and strongholds to launch surprise attacks. Roman soldiers often faced difficult terrain and determined opponents who knew the landscape intimately. But the empire's resources were immense. Roman legions slowly advanced, crushing resistance village by village. The final stage of the war centered around the fortress of Badr, Bar Kokhba's last stronghold. In 135 CE, Roman forces surrounded the fortress. After a brutal siege, Badr fell. Bar Kokhba was killed and the rebellion collapsed. The consequences were devastating. Roman historians described enormous casualties among the Jewish population. Entire villages were destroyed. Agricultural lands were devastated. Survivors were killed, enslaved, or forced into exile. Hadrian implemented harsh measures to prevent future revolts. Judea was renamed Syria Palestina, erasing the ancient name associated with the Jewish people. Jerusalem was rebuilt as the Roman city of Aelia Capitolina, and Jews were banned from entering the city, except on a single day each year to mourn the destruction of the temple. These policies were designed to break the connection between the Jewish people and their ancestral homeland. Yet memory proved stronger than imperial decrees. Across the diaspora, Jewish communities continued preserving traditions that centered on Jerusalem and the land of Israel. Prayers invoked the hope of returning to Zion. Festivals commemorated both ancient triumphs and tragedies. Meanwhile, life in the renamed province continued under Roman rule. Non-Jewish populations gradually became more prominent in the region. Greek and Roman cultural influences shaped urban life. Pagan temples and Roman administrative structures defined the landscape of cities like Caesarea and Aelia Capitolina. Christian communities also began growing throughout the region. What had once been a small Jewish sect centered on the teachings of Jesus gradually expanded into a distinct religious movement. As Christianity spread across the Roman world, Jerusalem acquired new significance for Christian believers. Pilgrims traveled to locations associated with the life and death of Jesus. Churches were established at sites believed to mark key events in Christian tradition. Over the next centuries, the region would experience dramatic religious transformations. Roman paganism would eventually decline. Christianity would rise to become the dominant faith of the empire. And the land once ruled by ancient Israelite kings would become sacred to multiple religions simultaneously. Yet despite these changes, Jewish memory of the land endured through prayer, scholarship, and tradition. Even in exile, the connection remained unbroken. The story of Israel had entered a long era without sovereignty, but not without identity. And centuries later, that identity would once again reshape the destiny of the land. After the catastrophic defeat of the Bar Kokhba revolt in 135 CE, the land once known as Judea entered a new and unfamiliar era. The Roman Empire had crushed Jewish resistance with overwhelming force, and the consequences reshaped the region's demographic, political, and religious landscape for centuries. The province itself was renamed Syria Palestina, a deliberate effort by the Roman Emperor Hadrian to sever the historical association between the Jewish people and their ancestral homeland. Jerusalem was rebuilt as the Roman city of Aelia Capitolina, a fully Romanized settlement complete with pagan temples, Roman forums, and imperial statues. Jews were banned from entering the city except once a year, when they were permitted to mourn the destruction of the temple. For many Jewish communities, This marked the beginning of a prolonged period of exile and dispersion. Yet exile did not erase identity. Across the Roman world, Jewish life continued to flourish. Large communities existed in cities such as Alexandria, Antioch, Babylon, and Rome itself. These communities maintained traditions rooted in the land of Israel while adapting to the realities of diaspora life. The rabbinic scholars who had preserved Jewish learning after the destruction of the Second Temple continued expanding their work. Over the following centuries, their debates and interpretations were eventually compiled into the Talmud, a monumental body of religious scholarship that shaped Jewish law and daily life. While Jewish religious life continued in diaspora, the land itself experienced profound cultural transformation. One of the most significant changes occurred during the 4th century CE. The Roman Empire itself was undergoing a religious revolution. In 312 CE, the Roman Emperor Constantine experienced what he believed to be a divine vision before a decisive battle. After securing victory, Constantine embraced Christianity and gradually promoted the religion throughout the empire. Christianity, once a persecuted minority faith, now began rising to imperial prominence. By the end of the 4th century, Christianity had become the official religion of the Roman Empire. This transformation dramatically altered the religious landscape of Syria-Palestina. Jerusalem, once the center of Jewish worship and later a Roman pagan city, now became a sacred destination for Christians. Constantine's mother, Helena, traveled to the city and sponsored the construction of churches at sites believed to be connected to the life of Jesus. The most famous of these was the Church of the Holy Sepulchre, built over the location traditionally identified as the site of Jesus' crucifixion and burial. Pilgrims from across the Christian world began traveling to Jerusalem. The city gradually evolved into one of Christianity's most important holy centers. Christian monasteries spread throughout the surrounding countryside. Monks established communities in the deserts of Judea, seeking spiritual devotion through isolation and discipline. Meanwhile, the Jewish presence in the region remained limited but persistent. Small Jewish communities continued living in towns across Galilee and other parts of the province. Though barred from Jerusalem itself, Jewish scholars maintained academies and preserved religious traditions connected to the land. But the political stability of the Roman Empire did not last forever. In the late 4th and 5th centuries, the western half of the empire began collapsing under the pressure of economic instability, internal conflicts, and invasions by migrating tribes. The eastern half of the empire, centered in Constantinople, survived and eventually became known as the Byzantine Empire. The Byzantine rulers inherited control over Syria-Palestina and continued governing the region for several centuries. Under Byzantine rule, Christianity became deeply embedded in the identity of the land. Churches dominated urban skylines. Pilgrimage routes connected holy sites across Judea and Galilee. Christian festivals attracted travelers from distant parts of Europe and Asia. The Byzantine authorities sometimes imposed restrictions on Jewish religious practices, particularly during periods of heightened religious tension. Nevertheless, Jewish communities continued existing throughout the region. The next major transformation arrived in the 7th century. Far to the south, in the Arabian Peninsula, a new religious movement had begun spreading with remarkable speed. The religion was Islam. Founded by the Prophet Muhammad in the early 7th century, Islam rapidly united many of the tribes of Arabia under a shared religious and political identity. After Muhammad's death in 632 CE, Muslim armies launched campaigns beyond Arabia's borders. Within a generation, these armies would reshape the entire Middle East. In 636 CE, Muslim forces defeated the Byzantine army at the Battle of Yarmouk, one of the most decisive battles in regional history. The Byzantine Empire lost control of vast territories across Syria and Palestine. Soon afterward, Muslim forces entered Jerusalem. The city surrendered peacefully in 638 CE to the Muslim Caliph Umar ibn al-Khattab. According to historical accounts, Umar personally visited Jerusalem and guaranteed protection for the city's Christian and Jewish inhabitants. This policy reflected early Islamic principles that recognized Jews and Christians as people of the book, religious communities with their own sacred traditions. Under Muslim rule, Jerusalem gained new religious significance. Muslims believed the city to be connected to a miraculous event in the life of the Prophet Muhammad, known as the Night Journey, during which he was said to have traveled from Mecca to Jerusalem before ascending to heaven. In the late 7th century, the Umayyad Caliph Abd al-Malik commissioned one of the most recognizable monuments in the world. The Dome of the Rock. Constructed atop the Temple Mount, the structure became a symbol of Islamic presence in the city. Nearby, another major mosque known as Al-Aqsa was built, further establishing Jerusalem as an important center of Islamic worship. Despite the changes in political authority, the city remained sacred to multiple religions simultaneously. Christians continued maintaining their churches and pilgrimage traditions. Jewish communities gradually regained limited access to Jerusalem after centuries of exclusion. For several centuries under Islamic rule, the region experienced relative stability. Trade networks expanded across the Islamic world, connecting cities from Spain to Central Asia. Jerusalem and surrounding towns benefited from these commercial and cultural exchanges. However, the balance of power would eventually shift again. By the late 11th century, the Byzantine Empire sought assistance from Western Europe to defend its territories against expanding Muslim powers. This request triggered a chain of events that would lead to one of the most dramatic confrontations in medieval history. In 1095, Pope Urban II delivered a speech calling upon Christian knights and warriors to undertake a holy mission: reclaim Jerusalem from Muslim rule. His appeal ignited a massive movement across Europe. Thousands of knights, soldiers, and pilgrims joined what became known as the First Crusade. In 1099, Crusader armies reached Jerusalem after a long and brutal campaign across the eastern Mediterranean. The siege of the city was fierce. When Crusader forces finally breached Jerusalem's walls, they carried out a massacre that shocked even some contemporaries. Muslim and Jewish residents were killed in large numbers as Crusaders claimed the city in the name of Christian rule. Jerusalem became the capital of a new Crusader kingdom. For nearly a century, Crusader states controlled large portions of the Levant. Christian rulers governed Jerusalem and surrounding territories, constructing castles and fortifications to defend their fragile kingdom. But their hold on the region was never secure. Muslim leaders across the Middle East gradually organized efforts to reclaim the lost territories. The most famous of these leaders was a Kurdish general named Saladin. In 1187, Saladin's forces defeated the Crusader army at the Battle of Hattin. The victory opened the path to Jerusalem. Later that same year, Saladin entered the city. Unlike the earlier Crusader conquest, the Muslim recapture of Jerusalem avoided widespread massacre. Christian residents were allowed to leave peacefully after paying ransom, while Islamic rule was restored. The city once again became part of the Muslim world. Yet the struggle for control of the Holy Land did not end. Over the following centuries, additional crusades attempted, often unsuccessfully, to retake Jerusalem. The region remained a battleground between competing powers until a new empire emerged that would dominate the land for the next 400 years. The Ottoman Empire. Under Ottoman rule, the land known today as Israel and Palestine would enter a long period of imperial administration, relative stability, and gradual demographic change. But beneath that stability, new ideas about nationalism, identity, and homeland were slowly beginning to emerge. And in the centuries ahead, those ideas would ignite one of the most complex and enduring conflicts in modern history. When the Ottoman Empire absorbed the lands of the eastern Mediterranean in 1517, the territory historically known as Palestine entered a new imperial era that would last for 4 centuries. The Ottomans, emerging from Anatolia as one of the most powerful empires of the early modern world, had already conquered Constantinople in 1453 and expanded across southeastern Europe, the Middle East, and North Africa. Under the rule of Sultan Selim I, Ottoman forces defeated the Mamluk Sultanate of Egypt and incorporated Syria, Palestine, and Egypt into their empire. For the first time in centuries, the region became part of a vast political system stretching across 3 continents. Unlike earlier conquerors, the Ottomans governed through a relatively flexible administrative structure. Provinces were divided into districts governed by appointed officials who collected taxes, maintained order, and oversaw local affairs. Religious communities were granted varying degrees of autonomy through a system known as the millet structure, which allowed different faith groups to manage their internal religious and legal matters. In the land of Palestine, the population during the early Ottoman centuries remained relatively small and diverse. Muslim Arabs formed the majority of the rural population, living in villages that cultivated olives, wheat, and grapes across the hills and valleys. Christian communities continued residing in cities such as Jerusalem, Bethlehem, and Nazareth, maintaining churches and pilgrimage traditions. Small Jewish communities persisted as well, particularly in cities like Safed, Tiberias, Jerusalem, and Hebron. Though these communities differed in religion and culture, they often lived in close proximity, sharing markets, trade routes, and local economic systems. The Ottoman government generally prioritized stability and tax collection rather than aggressive cultural assimilation. As long as communities paid taxes and maintained order, they were allowed to practice their religious traditions. Jerusalem itself remained a city of extraordinary spiritual importance. For Muslims, the Al-Aqsa Mosque and the Dome of the Rock represented sacred connections to Islamic history. For Christians, the Church of the Holy Sepulchre remained the focal point of pilgrimage from across Europe. For Jews, the Western Wall, the remaining retaining wall of the ancient temple complex, served as a site of prayer and remembrance. Despite the city's sacred status, Jerusalem during much of the Ottoman period was not a major political center. It functioned primarily as a provincial town within the broader imperial administration. Yet the region did experience periods of cultural and economic vitality. One notable center of Jewish life during the 16th century emerged in the Galilean city of Safed. Safed became a hub of Jewish scholarship, mysticism, and legal thought. Influential rabbis developed the mystical tradition known as Kabbalah, producing spiritual teachings that would influence Jewish communities worldwide. At the same time, trade routes connecting Damascus, Cairo, and Mediterranean ports passed through the region, allowing merchants to move goods across imperial territories. For centuries, life in Ottoman Palestine followed rhythms shaped by agriculture, pilgrimage, and imperial administration. But by the 19th century, the stability of the Ottoman Empire began weakening. Across Europe, the rise of industrialization, nationalism, and modern political movements was reshaping the global balance of power. European empires increasingly sought influence in Ottoman territories, sometimes through diplomacy, sometimes through military pressure. The Ottoman Empire itself began introducing reforms aimed at modernizing its administration and strengthening central authority. These reforms, known as the Tanzimat, attempted to reorganize taxation, legal systems, and military structures. At the same time, new ideas about national identity were spreading across Europe. Among Jewish communities in Europe, a movement gradually emerged that would transform the future of the land of Palestine. This movement became known as Zionism. For centuries, Jewish communities in diaspora had preserved spiritual connections to the land of Israel through prayer and tradition. Many prayers expressed longing for a future return to Zion, the ancient name associated with Jerusalem. But in the late 19th century, these ancient hopes began taking on a new political dimension. The catalyst for this transformation was a combination of factors. Jewish communities across Europe faced waves of anti-Semitic violence and discrimination. In the Russian Empire, violent pogroms targeted Jewish neighborhoods, destroying homes and businesses. In Western Europe, anti-Semitism persisted despite Jewish participation in modern economic and cultural life. One particularly influential event occurred in France during the 1890s. A Jewish army officer named Alfred Dreyfus was falsely accused of treason in a scandal that exposed deep anti-Semitic attitudes within French society. The affair shocked many observers who had believed European societies were moving toward greater equality. Among those profoundly affected was a journalist named Theodor Herzl. Herzl concluded that Jewish safety could not be guaranteed through assimilation into European societies alone. Instead, he argued that Jews needed a homeland where they could govern themselves. In 1897, Herzl convened the first Zionist Congress in Basel, Switzerland. Delegates from across Europe gathered to discuss the creation of a Jewish homeland. While various locations were debated, the land historically associated with ancient Israel, Palestine, held powerful symbolic and cultural significance. The Zionist movement began organizing efforts to encourage Jewish immigration to Palestine. These early immigrants, known as pioneers or Aliza migrants, established agricultural settlements and communal farms. They purchased land, built villages, and attempted to create new forms of collective social organization. At the time, Palestine remained under Ottoman control, and its population consisted primarily of Arab Muslims and Christians who had lived in the region for generations. Initially, Jewish immigration remained relatively small, but tensions gradually increased as demographic changes began affecting local economic and social structures. Land purchases by Zionist organizations sometimes displaced tenant farmers, creating resentment among Arab communities. Meanwhile, the Ottoman Empire itself continued weakening. By the early 20th century, it was often described by European observers as the sick man of Europe. Rival powers sought to expand their influence over Ottoman territories. When World War I erupted in 1914, the Ottoman Empire aligned itself with Germany and the Central Powers. The war would dramatically reshape the Middle East. British forces advanced through the region, defeating Ottoman armies and capturing key cities including Jerusalem in 1917. That same year, the British government issued a declaration that would profoundly influence the future of Palestine. The Balfour Declaration. In a letter written by British Foreign Secretary Arthur Balfour, the British government expressed support for the establishment of a national home for the Jewish people in Palestine, while also stating that the rights of existing non-Jewish communities should not be harmed. The declaration reflected a complex mixture of strategic wartime diplomacy, political lobbying, and humanitarian considerations. But it also introduced a fundamental ambiguity. Two communities now held competing visions for the same land. For Zionist leaders, the declaration represented international recognition of the Jewish aspiration for a homeland. For Arab residents of Palestine, it raised fears that their own political future might be threatened. After World War I ended in 1918, the Ottoman Empire collapsed. Palestine came under British administration as part of a League of Nations mandate system intended to govern former Ottoman territories. Under British rule, the region entered a new and turbulent phase. Jewish immigration increased significantly during the 1920s and 1930s, particularly as Jews fled rising persecution in Europe. New cities and agricultural settlements expanded rapidly. At the same time, Arab communities grew increasingly concerned about political marginalization and demographic change. Protests, riots, and clashes erupted periodically between the two populations. The British authorities attempted to manage the conflict through commissions, proposals for political reforms, and restrictions on immigration. But tensions continued escalating. By the late 1930s, widespread Arab revolts challenged British authority and Jewish immigration policies. Violence spread across the countryside and cities alike. The British Mandate faced an increasingly unstable situation. Meanwhile, events unfolding in Europe would soon transform the stakes of the conflict entirely. Within a few years, the horrors of the Holocaust would shock the world and intensify global debates about the future of the Jewish people. And the land of Palestine, long contested through centuries of empire, religion, and migration, would soon become the focal point of one of the most consequential political decisions of the 20th century. By the late 1930s, the land of Palestine stood at the center of an increasingly volatile political storm. Under British rule, the region had become the focal point of two powerful and competing national movements. For the Jewish Zionist movement, Palestine represented the long-awaited opportunity to restore a national homeland after nearly 2,000 years of dispersion. Waves of Jewish immigrants had arrived from Europe and other parts of the world, building farms, towns, and institutions that laid the foundation for a future state. For the Arab population of Palestine, however, these developments raised profound fears about their own political future. Arab communities had lived in the land for generations under Ottoman rule, and many believed that the rapid expansion of Jewish settlement threatened their rights, their land, and their national identity. The British Mandate authorities found themselves trapped between these competing aspirations. During the 1930s, tensions erupted into widespread violence. Arab revolts challenged both British authority and Jewish immigration. Armed groups attacked settlements, transportation routes, and government offices. British forces responded with military crackdowns, arrests, and new administrative restrictions. Attempts to find political compromise repeatedly failed. British commissions proposed dividing the land into separate Jewish and Arab states, but neither side accepted the proposals in their original form. The conflict remained unresolved as the world approached the brink of another global war. When World War II erupted in 1939, the crisis surrounding Palestine temporarily receded as global attention shifted toward the enormous struggle unfolding across Europe, Asia, and North Africa. But events during the war would transform the moral and political landscape surrounding the Jewish question. Nazi Germany, under the leadership of Adolf Hitler, implemented a systematic campaign to exterminate Europe's Jewish population. Millions of Jewish men, women, and children were murdered in ghettos, mass shootings, and extermination camps in what became known as the Holocaust. By the time the war ended in 1945, approximately 6 million Jews had been killed. The scale of the tragedy shocked the world. For many survivors, returning to their former homes in Europe was impossible. Entire communities had been destroyed. Families were gone. Antisemitism remained deeply rooted in many regions. For Zionist leaders, the Holocaust reinforced the urgency of establishing a Jewish state where Jews could live in security and self-determination. Jewish refugee ships carrying Holocaust survivors attempted to reach Palestine, but British immigration restrictions limited the number allowed to enter. Some ships were intercepted by British naval forces, and their passengers were placed in detention camps. These dramatic scenes intensified international pressure on Britain to resolve the future of Palestine. After the war, the British government concluded that the mandate had become unmanageable. Violence between Jewish underground groups, Arab militants, and British forces had escalated. Britain decided to refer the issue to the newly formed United Nations. In 1947, the United Nations Special Committee on Palestine examined the situation and proposed a dramatic solution. The land would be partitioned into two separate states, one Jewish and one Arab, while Jerusalem would be placed under international administration. The plan reflected the belief that both national movements possessed legitimate claims, but could not coexist within a single political framework at that time. On November 29, 1947, the United Nations General Assembly voted on the partition plan. The resolution passed. Jewish leaders accepted the plan despite its limitations, viewing it as a historic opportunity to establish sovereignty. Arab leaders rejected the proposal, arguing that it unfairly divided land where Arabs still constituted a large portion of the population. Violence erupted almost immediately after the vote. Clashes between Jewish and Arab militias spread across cities and rural areas. Roads became dangerous battlegrounds. Bombings, ambushes, and retaliatory attacks intensified as the British prepared to withdraw from the mandate. The conflict escalated into a full-scale civil war. On May 14, 1948, as British forces completed their withdrawal, Jewish leaders proclaimed the establishment of a new state, the State of Israel. The declaration was made in Tel Aviv by David Ben-Gurion, one of the central figures of the Zionist movement. For Jewish communities around the world, the moment represented the realization of a national dream rooted in centuries of history, faith, and longing. But the declaration also triggered immediate war. Neighboring Arab states, including Egypt, Jordan, Syria, Lebanon, and Iraq, launched military interventions into the former Mandate territory. The First Arab-Israeli War had begun. The war lasted through 1948 and into 1949. Israeli forces, composed of various Jewish militias reorganized into a national army, fought against multiple Arab armies advancing from different directions. Battles raged across the landscape, from the coastal plains to the hills surrounding Jerusalem. By the time ceasefire agreements were reached in 1949, Israel had secured control over a larger portion of territory than originally allocated by the United Nations partition plan. The war also produced a massive humanitarian crisis. Hundreds of thousands of Palestinian Arabs fled or were expelled from their homes during the fighting. Many became refugees in neighboring countries or in territories controlled by Jordan and Egypt. This displacement, known among Palestinians as the Nakba, or catastrophe, remains one of the central historical traumas shaping Palestinian identity. Meanwhile, Jewish communities across the Middle East faced increasing hostility in the years following Israel's creation. Many Jews from Arab countries emigrated to Israel, dramatically increasing the population of the new state. The conflict between Israel and its Arab neighbors did not end with the 1948 war. Over the following decades, multiple wars and political crises reshaped the region. In 1967, the Six-Day War dramatically altered the map when Israel captured the West Bank, East Jerusalem, Gaza Strip, Sinai Peninsula, and Golan Heights. These territorial changes intensified debates about borders, sovereignty, and the future of Palestinian statehood. Later conflicts, including the Yom Kippur War of 1973, uprisings known as the Intifadas, and numerous diplomatic negotiations, continued shaping the modern political landscape. Peace agreements were achieved with some neighboring countries, including Egypt and Jordan, but a comprehensive resolution to the Israeli-Palestinian conflict remained elusive. Today, the land between the Mediterranean Sea and the Jordan River remains one of the most politically and emotionally contested regions in the world. For Jews, it represents the historic homeland promised in ancient traditions and restored through modern statehood. For Palestinians, it represents the land of their ancestors and the center of their struggle for national recognition and independence. For billions of people across the globe, it is sacred ground connected to the histories of Judaism, Christianity, and Islam. Few places on earth carry such layers of meaning. The history of Israel and the land surrounding it is not merely the story of kings, wars, and empires. It is a story of memory, a story of faith, a story of longing, loss, resilience, and return. Across 4,000 years, civilizations have risen and fallen upon this narrow strip of land. Empires have conquered it, religions have sanctified it, generations have fought to claim it. And yet the questions that opened this story remain as powerful today as they were in ancient times. Who belongs to this land? Who governs it? And how can a place so deeply sacred to so many ever find lasting peace? History does not always provide clear answers, but it does remind us of one truth that echoes across every chapter of this long and contested story. The land itself endures, empires fade, borders change. But the human search for belonging, identity, and peace continues, generation after generation.